Paul Wright is the former editor of the UMass Press in Boston. He was in that position from 1988 to 2006, and he is now a publishing and print culture historian. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
My pleasure.
I wonder, just to start off, if you could give us a bit of an idea of your role as the editor of the UMass Press. What do you do?
Well, I was an acquisitions editor, which means I approach authors, I review manuscripts, assess proposals, help put together the list, the seasonal list, read the damn things, do a preliminary edit, pass it on to the production and copy editors, and hope for the best.
Okay. That was to start with.
Well, let's back up a little bit. I started out in publishing as a production editor.
Okay.
Which means taking the copy edited product through the production process. During that time I learned a lot about how books are made, about typography and processes and so on.
So what? Press checks and
proofreading.
Proofreading.
The first thing they ever gave me to do was to proofread an index of a book I had never seen.
Okay.
And I couldn't find anything wrong with it, so I thought I'd failed.
Well, you couldn't check the page number with the
It was a complete mystery to me what the proofreading marks were. I actually got a Webster's Dictionary had a list of proofreading marks, and I studied that to find out what I was supposed to write on the damn pages.
So they just threw you in.
Yeah.
Okay.
This was when I was right out of the Army.
Okay.
And then I did some freelance writing and a bunch of educational projects, and also went to graduate school. And
Here in Boston? Or?
Yeah, at Boston University in American Studies. Studied with a famous book historian, David Hall.
David Hall?
And
did he write the history of the Harvard University Press?
No, that's Max Hall.
They related?
Not related.
Okay.
David was the general editor of the History of the Book in America series that you probably know. It started with Cambridge and then went on to North Carolina Press, like 6 volumes over there.
Oh yeah, okay. When did that come out?
Probably the last volume came out in 16 or 17.
Okay.
Took a long time.
Yeah.
A massive project, a terrific project.
Lots of contributors?
Lots of contributors, the major scholars in the field. All of them, I think, pro bono.
Oh.
I was supposed to write a chapter on the university presses in the post-war period.
Okay.
And I never heard anything about any stipend.
Ah, okay.
And I never got around to writing the piece either.
Right.
So anyway, from there I got into acquisitions editing in a commercial library publisher named G.K. Hall.
Another Hall.
Yeah. And then eventually wound up at UMass Boston working for the Chancellor, and I said to him, you know, I'm an editor. Do you want to have an editor of the University Press on the Boston campus? And he said, yes. So that's how it all came to be. I worked with a really wonderful guy named Bruce Wilcox, whose mother had been the managing editor at Harvard Press. I think I lost the thread of the question. Oh.
Just the role of,
Yeah.
what the role of an editor of University Press would be.
I think it's mainly to keep in touch with networks of scholars who are the primary audience, the primary authors, and the primary reviewers of this very small, relatively small community of folks who are interested in specific areas. And it turned out that the history of books in general and publishing and reading and authorship turned out to be a very interesting, dynamic, interdisciplinary endeavor that started up in the late 90s, I guess.
So yeah, what got you into, first of all, what is book history?
Well, it's the history of, it derives from a French movement called Histoire du Livre. The history of the book is translation into English, and it's basically to understand that books are not just objects, they have a history, and they're not just vehicles for ideas and expression, they're also expressions in themselves. They can be understood to carry messages and in their formats, and and they're linked to social and cultural history because of the great increase in literacy, at least in the West, in the 19th and 20th centuries. So
Right.
they became big business, books did.
Yeah.
And
Well,
print culture in general.
yeah.
Magazines, newspapers.
Yeah. No TV, no radio. So.
And now we're in the point where the internet has taken away a lot of the audience for those traditional print outlets.
Right. And so, what was it then that made you focus on this area as a publishing venture?
Partly was my own graduate training, in which I started out a dissertation on the Boston publishing community before the Civil War, at the period when the great American Renaissance was taking place. And I just thought it would be very interesting to understand the publishers, of which I was one, not a 19th century publisher, but a publisher.
So that's Ticknor and Fields and people like
Ticknor
that?
and Fields is the important and well-known name. They published Hawthorne and Thoreau, and later on Emerson.
They had the old corner...
Old Corner Bookstore, yes.
Yeah.
Early on in my career, I wrote a treatment of the Old Corner Bookstore for the architects who redeveloped it as a commercial space.
A treatment of what?
A historical summary of what had happened in the building.
So that what? They could gut the place?
Well, no, they didn't gut it. They tried to reproduce some of the ambience of a 19th century bookstore. And for many years it was a bookstore that was run by the Boston Globe in the late 20th century.
Okay, because now it's a Chipotle.
Yes. It's sad, and it's too bad that at least the basic shape of the building is preserved.
But what have they done to the insides?
I don't know. I haven't been in there.
Because that sure would be a good project to bring it back the way it was.
It would be great to make it even into a sort of a cultural museum of some sort.
Yeah, because I know that whole area is just thick with literary history.
Oh, yeah. So I got interested in 19th century publishing as a graduate student, and then I went on to editing and publishing myself. And in 1990 or 91, I went to a seminar at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, the summer seminar on the book.
And they've got a pretty decent library there, right?
They stop at 1877. You know this, right?
No.
The American Antiquarian Society collects everything up to the disputed election of 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes became president by a compromise with the Congress, and the Democrat Samuel Tilden was kicked out.
Okay.
Right after the Grant administration. Anyway, for pre-1877 imprints, they have the best collection in the world, and they have the greatest staff.
Of just American or everything?
Mostly Americana, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And once you get into the pre-revolutionary period, of course, it's English and some continental materials too.
Right.
So it was like summer camp for book nerds. It was 2 weeks in the summer in Worcester, and all we did was we went to classes in the day, and we would buy a case of beer and get drunk at night and talk about books.
Wonderful.
It was great. And I made a lot of contacts with people, and one of the things that came out of it was this Perspectives on American Book History, which was intended for, and I hope it's used in classes. Came out in 2002, I think.
And basically you got a lot of the contacts that you'd made there to contribute
I did.
their take on, or their areas of study as it related to book history.
Yeah, it attempts to be chronologically comprehensive, starting with the colonial period and moving right through to the 20th century. And one of the guys who edited it, Jeff Groves, was my roommate at this seminar.
Okay.
And several of the people that are in it were there. It was such a sharing and collegial community that no one involved with this book had ever received a penny of royalties. They all did it pro bono to advance the field. The only money we spent on the book, cash, pre-press, was paying some reproduction fees. But the American Antiquarian, God bless them, let us have complete access to their collection, so everything up to the 1877 we got to use for free.
And that means photographs primarily?
Photographs, documents.
Yeah.
And this is before the internet was really reliable and ubiquitous.
Yeah.
So it has a CD in it
Oh, excellent.
with all the images.
Yeah, yeah.
Nowadays, you'd go to a website and get the images.
Right. So, is this the first big foray into the...
This particular book, Perspectives in American Book History, was maybe the third or fourth book in a series that the UMass Press let me start, called Studies in Print Culture and the History of the Book. And the first book that I did in the series was with David Hall, who had been my mentor, and who was actively editing the big History of the Book in America project. And it was a collection of his programmatic and professional papers on book history. Did very well, and it sort of kicked the series off, because then people would look and say, well, David's publishing there, so yeah.
I see, okay. So it was your initiative, and you just felt that this was an interesting new field that the press would do well by to promote and reach out to these scholars and help them get their research out.
Yeah, I think we were one of the first University Press series in this area. There are several now. Toronto has one.
And so again, it was just you just thought this was a fascinating field that was underserved by publishers.
It was, yeah, and it was also a field that was growing exponentially and was bringing in a lot of young, interesting people. It was bringing in bibliographers and historians, literary critics, literary historians, even social and cultural historians, because the book is a place where all this stuff meets.
Yeah, you put it very well here. You talk about the book, it's a physically made object as a conjunction flowing together and a nexus of social currents, intellectual trends, economic potential, historical forces, technological advances, commercial demands. It's a fluid, contingent, socially constructed, and even an accidental,
I'm not sure. I can't remember my own words. I'm just listening to you say this, and I'm thinking there's a whole damn dissertation in there.
Well, I was just about to say, I want to break this down a bit.
Yeah.
Like, for example, we talk about social currents. So how does book history reflect social currents?
Well, it has to do with popular culture, popular taste.
Then again, this would be the books that are published at the time and the subjects that they deal with.
And part of the issue with book history is that in the past, in literary criticism particularly, the great canon was studied.
Yeah.
Underneath and around that is an entire world of secondary literature, of religious publications, of popular novels, of pornography.
Yeah.
That's been studied pretty well by, what's her name? She teaches at Smith. I can't remember now. But so, let's say Moby Dick is floating on, like Queequeg's coffin, on a huge sea of print culture that's, sort of undulating and swelling and breaking like an ocean.
Right. So, I mean, in the past it was just Moby Dick. Now we're getting all of the in fiction anyway, books that haven't stood the test of time, but were out there and influencing people.
Hundreds and thousands of them, and books that people like Melville read.
Right.
Melville was an omnivorous autodidact, and he read 2 or 3 newspapers a day.
Huh.
He read, when he wanted to become a poet, which he did late in his life, he read something like 200 or 300 of the classics of English poetry. We have his books, we have his annotations in them.
Right. That's a beautiful example of book history then.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what does that help to tell us then if we've got his annotated books?
Well, we can understand more about the creative mind.
Yeah.
We can understand more about Moby Dick, which still has its enigmas, and we can understand the cultural predecessors of our own day. You can look at comparative editions of Moby Dick and just see the taste in book design and book production and jacket design developing over the years.
Yeah, of that one book in particular.
That one book in particular.
Yeah, yeah.
You could do a whole seminar on just the ways that Moby Dick was presented.
Right.
Then it gets presented in film. There's a beautiful illustrated edition of Moby Dick which does an illustration for every page of the text in one particular edition.
Oh my goodness, it must be a thick book.
This guy's name is Matt Kish, and it's worth looking at.
I know Barry Moser's
Barry did that beautiful
Aryan Press one.
Aryan Press one. Yeah, I wish I had a copy of that.
Me too, yeah.
I have a copy of Barry's Bible.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that. I interviewed him not that long ago.
He's amazing. He has amazing facility.
Yeah.
I've seen him do a quick sketch for a friend of a harpoon.
Okay.
You know, 3 or 4 passes with a pen and it's there.
Yeah, no, he's just delightful to talk to too. He's quite a personality.
We knew him pretty well when we were out in Amherst. And when I was in graduate school in Amherst, I studied with a guy named Sidney Kaplan, who was Leonard Baskin's partner at the Corner Press. It's another way I got interested in printing and publishing.
Uh-huh. You saw what beautiful work they were doing?
Yeah, and I saw they had a big Heidelberg sitting on a Persian carpet in a press room that was as clean as an operating room. No ink, no oil, nothing. Pressman's name was Harold McGrath. He's
Yes, and Barry was raving about him. He was saying that he could line things up and, you know, in a way that that very, very few others could.
Harold was fantastic, and letterpress requires attention to the impression. You can't fool around. You either get a mess or you get a really beautiful, crisp impression that you can actually you can feel it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't destroy the paper. Harold was terrific.
So that was one of the reasons that you were bitten then.
Yeah, and just you know, some people just love books. You know that.
I know it's. And when you're asked about why, you can think there's possibilities that my father took me to bookstores when I was a little kid. I didn't like it all the time, but obviously I sure do now.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard to pinpoint a reason.
My son got a management degree at Yale, and in the course of his career, he wound up as a vice president for supply chain management at Random House, big time job, and he once gave us a talk to his warehouse staff, and he said, "I grew up in a house with 5,000 books, many of them Random House books," and he says, "Probably some of you were picking and packing the books that my father has."
That's neat, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It really, and the environment that a kid grows up in. Look where he ended up. It's very powerful.
And he also, when he was at Bertelsmann, he was working as a consultant with Booz Allen, and he said to me, "The secret of publishing is you have to publish bestsellers and you have to print a lot of them."
Right.
He get a more nuanced.
Yeah. Well, that's the story these days. Is they're all after the bestsellers, and they're, if you don't have the potential to be a blockbuster, they're nowhere near as interested in you, are they? It's not such a good.
Yeah, the death of the middle range book.
Yeah.
Either fiction or nonfiction, and a lot of us in university presses were picking up some of those titles for a while.
Right.
Because it addresses an audience, and it. You could sell 10, 20,000 maybe, which would be a big sale for a university press.
Yeah. So when you started publishing books on book history, what was your intention? Like, where did you want to go with this series?
I mainly wanted to publish the best of the recent scholarship, advance the field, I guess you'd say, and entertain myself. I mean, any editor who doesn't like the books that they publish is in the wrong business.
Right. So you basically went after books that you really wanted to read yourself.
Exactly. That's the strongest editorial position to come from.
Well, yeah. I suppose you become an expert in the field.
Yeah. I mean, I could talk the talk with them, and I could understand what they were trying to do. It's not a huge audience, and the marketing and bottom line is dicey.
Yeah.
In any university press book, but since it had a crossover audience of interdisciplinary sort, we thought we could make some money with it.
Yeah.
I think it probably, my guess is it's broken even, but I don't know. I know this book is done well and used in courses.
Let's get the title of that again.
Yeah, it's called Perspectives on American Book History, Artifacts and Commentary. Edited by Scott Casper, Joan Chasen, and Jeffrey Groves.
Would you say that's a really good introduction to the field?
Yep. For American,
Okay.
the American stuff. It has a very, very special introductory essay by Bob Gross, who's another famous, well-known book historian. Lives out in Concord.
Concord.
Yeah, Mass. He did a book on the Concord during the American Revolution, and now he's just writing a sequel on Concord during the Transcendental period. You know, Emerson and Thoreau were out there, the Alcotts.
Right. Yeah, I've been to some of their houses.
Yeah.
What about some of the big titles in the field that people might want to familiarize themselves with?
Going way back to the 60s, there's Elizabeth Eisenstein's The Printing Press is an Agent of Change. You probably know that book.
I've heard the title. I haven't read it. Yeah.
Which, when I was a graduate student, was a revelation to see somebody do this book, which argues that the scientific revolution and the Reformation were all, and I mean this is pretty commonplace now, we're all driven by the printing press.
Yeah.
And the relatively cheap, relatively ubiquitous text that could be available to scholars. Another important figure is Robert Darnton. You probably know him.
I'm off to interview him this afternoon.
Oh, okay. Is he still at Harvard?
That's where we're meeting. I don't know if he's...
Yeah, he was head of library at Harvard for a while.
That's right.
And he did wonderful work on the French Revolution and the book trade, and how the subversive aspects of the book trade overturned the Ancien regime and so on. He developed this very sophisticated theory of the circulation of book culture and the way that books were produced, marketed, and the feedback loop of readers. Terrific and very, very inspiring.
Okay. Anyone else?
David Hall, as I said.
Yeah.
Very important.
Okay.
Another fellow that I studied with at the American Antiquarian Summer Seminar, Michael Winship.
Oh, yeah.
Did a very interesting and serious book on Ticknor and Fields as a business in the 19th century. And he's also done work on Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is one of the all-time seminal books in American print culture, American history.
That was published by Beaton, wasn't it, in England, I think.
I don't know who published it in England.
I think it was. It's the husband of the woman that did the famous cookbook.
Ah, okay.
And he was a publisher.
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think there's a connection there.
There was a strong abolitionist movement in England, and I wouldn't be surprised. It was published here in Boston by Jewett.
Okay.
It's first published, I think, serially, and then published as a book. Lincoln called it the little book that made the big war. That may be apocryphal. We don't know for sure.
Right.
But it makes sense, because it did. Uncle Tom's Cabin really did catalyze a lot of abolitionist thought about slavery, but in the popular culture, it was probably not. It didn't come to the fore as an issue that people wanted to confront until they read Uncle Tom's Cabin. The sentimental picture of the.
They're able to empathize.
Yeah.
Huh.
I did publish a book on Uncle Tom's Cabin by a woman named Barbara Hochman, teaches in Israel.
Okay.
Another interesting book that we published in that series was on Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book, and it's called What a Book Can Do.
And again, it just talked about the impact of this book.
Right. The origins of it, the publication history. It was published first in the New Yorker, I think, as a lengthy piece, and then eventually as a book. JFK latched onto it, and it inspired him to sort of generate a political environmental
policy.
And Rachel Carson was a terrific writer. I mean, she just was a very good writer and a very good scientist, so it turned out to be one of the books that influenced the 20th century.
Yeah. You call publishing Anarchy masquerading as business.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to explicate that. It's like the business there is making a product for the marketplace. The anarchy part is rounding up all the, like herding cats, rounding up all the pieces that would work. The author at the right moment, a manuscript that's readable, if it needs illustrations, the capital for it all. On any given day, I think I would deal with 20 different projects, pieces of them. So
Right.
It seemed like stuff was flying in and out all the time. And the internet made it easier, but it made it more hectic because more
Yeah.
stuff happened.
And more stuff coming at you at the same time,
Yeah.
I guess.
So all of these pieces are coming together, and finally, at a moment, you have a publication day, you can hold up a printed book
Right.
and put it on the marketplace. But it seemed that it was not a carefully planned step-by-step procedure.
Even though at the end it looks
It looks like if somebody knew what
very
they were.
organized.
Yeah, it looked like somebody knew what they were doing.
So how many in total in that series did it go? It went for years, I
It's
guess.
still going.
It's still going.
Yeah,
Oh,
if you
great.
go to the website, it's just Google UMass Press and you'll come to the website, and there's probably 35 or 40 titles now.
Oh, great.
So I'm responsible for maybe the first 15.
So really, other university presses can get into the field if they want to, but you had an early start and you had a lot of the names already.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, especially in that, and call that an anthology.
This is a collection of readings, yeah.
That wasn't the first in the series, but it
Yeah,
seems
sort
to
of-
me it really pulled a lot of people in.
It encapsulates what the state of the discipline was in 2002 or whenever it came out.
Yeah, yeah. Are they going to be doing another similar one, or?
I don't know. A lot of people now have come along with readers and introductory texts. Routledge in England.
I saw that actually. I saw a copy of that the
Couple of
other
good
day
ones.
at the Harvard bookstore downstairs.
University of Pennsylvania Press has a series. Penn State Press has a series.
What do you think the best book, just as a aside from yours, of course, but as an introduction to the field for someone who's not an academic but who loves books? I mean, that your book isn't overly academic, is it?
It's geared at teaching upper level undergraduates and graduate students, and it has the citations, bibliography. The idea is to sort of get you so interested you follow up and do some work of your own. You can do work on individual titles, you can do work on genres, you can do work on publishers. One of the books I published was a study of Ezra Pound and New Directions.
Isn't that great? Yeah, because he had a big impact on the young James Laughlin, didn't he?
Yeah, oh yeah. Laughlin lived with him in Italy,
Yeah.
and of course Pound was famous for editing Eliot.
Yeah.
Cutting
yeah.
the wasteland down.
Well, Pound seemed to be, he knew absolutely everyone, and he helped everyone get published. And
He did, and he was wonderful until he ran into National Socialism and fascism.
yeah,
And
yeah.
He sort of lost his mind.
He did, yeah. But prior to that, yeah, he's just so important to
Yeah.
the literary culture, right?
Yep. It's part of that modernistic break with the 19th century genteel tradition.
Uh-huh.
So many great poets and novelists. James Joyce, one of my favorites. So a book that would, I think, this would be a good start.
Yeah.
You could look at the series that David Hall edited. There's a huge 2-volume collection from Oxford University Press.
Oh, that's beautiful, yeah.
It's called
That's the one in the slipcase there.
The Oxford Companion to the Book.
Okay.
Edited by a friend of mine, Michael Suarez.
Oh, yes. He runs the Rare Book School.
Michael runs the Rare Book School at Virginia. He's a Jesuit, although you wouldn't know. He puts S.J. after his name, but he doesn't wear the collar or anything. He's smart as a whip.
I've seen him present. He's very compelling.
Yeah.
He's an evangelist for the book.
He is.
Yeah.
And he studied with an important figure in England, D.F. McKenzie, who was a bibliographer who taught at Oxford. One of the really interesting books that McKenzie wrote. McKenzie is on the level of Darnton and Eisenstein in terms of influence and scholarship. And his book is called Bibliography and the Sociology of Texts. Fascinating book, published, I think, by Cambridge.
And what does that deal with?
It tries to bring into bibliography the description of books, the description of the social and cultural surround for a particular kind of book at a particular time.
Huh.
He does a lot with Elizabethan Jacobean books and the point when the printed book was just getting started.
Right. How it was read and
Yeah.
who read it and
Who read it?
how big the audience was. And
Many of the classics that we think of as books started out as in manuscript and were circulated in manuscript during the Renaissance. So McKenzie is another good one to start with.
okay. Yeah, but it really is quite a young field compared to others, I guess.
Young in the sense of this interdisciplinary melding, but
Yeah,
there have been great bibliographers going way back,
yeah.
including the founder of the American Antiquarian Society, Isaiah Thomas. He wrote a book called The History of the Book in America, I think.
That would have been way back in the early 1800s?
The History of Printing in America.
Okay. Because he was a publisher too, and a bookseller,
He
right?
was a newspaper and journal publisher in Boston, and he left Boston when the Brits came during the Revolution and moved out to Worcester.
But he published books, didn't he?
Published books, published newspapers, revolutionary tracts. And late in his life, I think he died in early 19th century, he did this History of Printing in America and founded the American Antiquarian. So the basic collection that the American Antiquarian built on is his books, his personal collection.
Is there a decent biography of him, I wonder?
If there isn't, there should be.
Yeah.
There is. It's called Isaiah Thomas, Printer and Patriot. But I can't remember the author's name.
Okay. The phenomenon of self-publishing is something that disturbs you.
Yes.
You call self-publishing a poor simulacrum of what I call the real book.
Yeah. This was a paper I gave a few years ago at Sharp, and it was at the point of time when desktop publishing had just become feasible, thanks to Macintosh and Adobe and so on. And people were coming to me, young scholars, coming to me with, oh, wait a minute.
A lot of traffic in Boston.
It's the worst city in the world.
My cab rides, I've had 2 today, bumper to bumper for like...
If you were coming out of South Station, it's just...
Yeah.
Back to, yes, so...
Self-publishing.
Self-publishing and young scholars were taking their dissertations, running them through the desktop publishing mill and presenting me with what they thought was a finished product that they thought that would ease my burden and that they could get a publication of the University Press, which is one of the ways of getting tenure. But they looked a little bit like a book.
Yeah.
They had type, they were justified, but they didn't have any of the what I would call value added that a publisher and an editor brings to it.
So what's the key value added then?
I think a good reading, pointing out errors in fact, errors in grammar, many spelling errors, even despite spell check.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes a lack of attention to audience. You write a dissertation for, half a dozen people on your committee, presumably, and it goes on the shelf and that's it. They had no sense of what a larger audience would be, or how to make all that incredible work they did on the dissertation available to people who didn't know or care about the specific narrow area, but they wanted to fit it into their cultural picture, a cultural construct. So that was my gripe. Plus, formatting issues were awful, and somehow people are afraid of blank pages and white space.
Yeah. Well, you point to the fact that 90% of books that are never published were suddenly appearing on the market.
That's true.
And the audience, there's no winnowing down, and the audience was overwhelmed and confused as a result, and you figure that devalues all print and throws into question the certification process that publication once offered.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair.
Really, right now, it's it's incredible the number of self-published books that are going out, and the printers are doing well by it, but I don't know about readers. You just have that many more books to choose from, I guess, but which are the good ones?
Part of editing and publishing used to be gatekeeping, which seemed somehow to limit or exclude, which, to be fair, did. I mean, how many?
Yeah.
Women and people of color didn't have access to print culture the way white males did.
Yeah.
But it also made the world of possible reading comprehensible, and it said to the reader, especially if you saw the imprint of a publisher on the title page, that someone had taken some care with it.
Yeah.
And that it had been reviewed, and I call it certified, for lack of a better term. It had an imprimatur.
Yeah. Just winding down here,
sure.
Is your favorite book history book? Which ones have you really loved reading?
These are the ones that inspired me. Elizabeth Eisenstein, Bob Darnton, Don McKenzie.
Yeah. But what about the one that you just love? That for example, sheds light on something that is...
I'll tell you. Okay. There was an older book. It's called Parnassus Corner.
Oh, yeah.
By Warren Tryon and Bill Sharbat. I'll follow that up with a little story about Sharbat. But that's about the old Corner Bookstore. Tryon collected first editions of Ticknor and Fields. He had hundreds of them. I don't know whatever happened to them. Right. But they were there in that building at the old corner for a while. And they just did a very nice job of describing the life of James T. Fields, who was a farm boy from New Hampshire, not a university guy. And Ticknor was a general merchant. He didn't really care too much about books. But it was, as I argue and they argue, publishing was a social mobility avenue for people like Fields to get into the gentry. Something that I found I was sympathetic to. Okay. So that's one of my favorite books. Bill Sharbat, who was another famous and important figure in the history of the book, wrote articles in the 50s on the business of publishing for Longfellow, Melville, Hawthorne, how they made money, how the publishers dealt with them. He was, and the first paper I ever gave, I dedicated to the memory of Bill Sharbat, because he was so inspirational. Years later, I found out that his daughter is one of my best friends, and I didn't know that.
Just simply because she had a different last name?
Yeah, she had a different last name.
Right.
And I happened to mention her father. I happened to mention Bill Sharbat to her, and she said, "Oh, that's my dad. He was at Ohio State, fantastic pioneer in the history of the book."
Yeah.
And later became one of the editors of the Center for the Edition of American Authors Hawthorne edition. Yeah. Interesting.
What, as far as books you've read go, have any of them motivated you to go out and collect any of these books that are mentioned? And if so, which?
I told you earlier that I tried to look at a first edition of Leaves of Grass.
Yeah.
But I'm not a collector.
No, okay.
I buy books to use them.
To read them.
And even make marks in them.
Right. Yeah.
That's that's a whole study itself of markings.
Marginalia, yeah.
Marginalia.
But none of this reading has motivated you to go out and I really want a copy of that for myself, to see the original and have it.
I'd like to see the originals. And
right.
I've looked at originals of Moby Dick, for instance.
Yeah.
Both the English and American editions. For one thing,
there's quite a difference, isn't there? I think the first chapter is left off or something like that.
The last chapter.
Last chapter, yeah. Okay.
And The English edition is a 3-decker, and the American edition is single volume.
Okay, yeah.
You could something about marketing books in Britain and America that they.
Yeah.
So I've always loved looking at the originals and looking at copies that the authors owned.
Yes.
Are very important to me. But I for one thing, they're very expensive.
Yeah, that'll deter.
I mean, if someone gave me a first folio, I'd take it.
Right. I guess you haven't taken, or it's not a question of taking the step, it's falling off the ledge or I mean, for me, it's like if, you know, for example, I was reading about, or actually I think it was a bookseller that told me about this great little series of books, Britain in Pictures. And so I started reading up on it, and they weren't expensive at all. They were $10 or $15 a piece.
Yeah.
And I think I'm up to 110 of them out of 130. But it's, I just love to have them.
Yeah. There's an attraction to books in series.
Mm-hmm.
I published a book, Jay Satterfield's book on the modern library.
Oh, the series.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that was Boney and Liverite to start.
Started with Boney and Liverite, and then Surf.
Yeah.
And his partner bought the rights, and Random House was built on reprints of classics in the modern library.
Right.
So there are people who collect modern library books, which are, they were $1 a piece when they were first produced, in good condition. I don't know what the prices are now.
A lot of it depends on who designed the jacket too.
Jacket designs, Rockwell Kent did some of them.
Yeah.
Binding designs change over the years.
Yeah. Leather, there was some.
Started with little leather books, and now
Yeah.
then we had this green buckram for years and years and years. So that's another whole field of collecting. I've done some work on the Harvard classics.
The Loeb?
The Harvard 5-foot shelf of books.
Oh yes, okay.
You can see them there on the second shelf.
Oh yes, yeah. What have you done on that?
I had a fellowship at the Houghton Library.
Okay.
So I thought I would do some research on the Harvard classics, which were edited by President Eliot in 1910, right after he retired. Turned out that all of his papers were, all of his papers, thousands of pieces, were in the Pusey Library in the Harvard Archives. So I had a Houghton Fellowship, but I spent all of my time down in the basement of Pusey going through Eliot's papers.
And just basically giving background on
Yeah.
how he edited and chose and.
He was approached by Collier's, which is a famous magazine publisher, but also published books, collections of great authors in sets for the general trade.
Yeah.
Mostly marketed by traveling salesmen and by mail sales through coupons that you could cut out of Collier's magazine. So they approached Eliot, and he said, "Oh, yeah, I could do that." And he rounded up a professor of English at Harvard named William Nielsen, who later became president of Smith. And they did this series, and it turned out Eliot made millions of dollars from it in his estate.
Because he got a piece of the action.
He had a piece of the action. He had the name of Harvard on every book, which even then had cachet.
Yes.
And
Well, obviously just for promoting the university.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the university wasn't happy about it, but somehow he talked the overseers into letting him use the Harvard name and the Veritas symbol on the.
Oh, right. Gives it credibility and helps the sales. Yeah.
And his own name was selling books, because he was known as a educational reformer. So I did some work on that, and I could start collecting those.
Well, you get them for pretty near nothing, right?
Yeah, but there are different states, there are different bindings. They came in half leather. They came. The ones I have are $1. I think $1 a volume.
That's how much they were initially sold for.
Yeah.
And you'd have a great library there too, wouldn't you?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it was the state of thinking about the classics of world literature at the time, 1910,
Did he add editorial commentary?
It's very very slight.
All right.
Little introductions.
So not much work and a ton of revenue for him.
Post, at the end, they did a series of guidebooks on how to use them. They were sort of assembled by whatever they could find and plates they could rent and so on. But after the fact, they thought, this is probably an educational project that we could do, so they did a series of guidebooks on how to use them and how to use them in self-education.
Yeah.
The theory was that for 10 minutes a day, you could become a literate, liberally educated individual like a Harvard graduate.
Oh, no.
It's a whole marketing thing.
Yeah. And so your research, you basically described how he went about this project and how successful the project was and the impact of it and all that kind of thing.
There's lots of correspondence with the publishers. There's lots of things that you don't usually find, like royalty statements.
Right.
So you can track the income that he made from them.
So you basically told the story of the 5 foot.
I gave 2 or 3 papers on it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I never got it around to writing it up. It's a book.
Okay. Well, just finally, what are you working on now, and why?
Right now in book history,
in book history. Yeah.
I'm working on the collected editions of Melville. Of the great American authors, his collected edition was the hardest one to get into print. It took a long time.
Because of copyright, or?
No, because of, 2 things. One, there was an English edition in the 1920s. You know, Melville was rediscovered in the 1920s. There was an English edition which was called the Standard Edition. Beautiful letterpress edition that sort of co-opted the field for a long time. And then after World War II, there was another Melville revival.
This was promulgated by interest from a famous scholar, or?
Well, one of the more important books was called The American Renaissance by F.O. Matheson at Harvard, published in 1940. Then the war came, and a lot of these students who knew about Matheson and went off to war, and then they came back and they went to graduate schools, particularly at Harvard and also at Yale, and started writing really good stuff on Melville. So there was a Melville Society formed, and there was an impetus to do a collected edition of Melville that would be more accurate and up to date than the English edition from the 1920s. And a publisher named Walter Hendricks somehow got in the field first and sort of co-opted and scared off a lot of university presses who wanted to do this, and signed up a lot of the prospective editors. Then he ran out of money, and he ran out of interest. And he founded Marlborough College in Vermont, which is now about to go out of business.
When did he do that? In the 50s or 40s?
In the 50s, and Marlborough's somewhere in the middle 50s, yeah. So this collected edition with some notable volumes, very good volumes, sputtered along and never quite finished. In the meantime, the Center of Edition for American Authors was created in 1960s, somewhere in the middle 60s, to promote proper editions of American classics. Hawthorne came out of that.
And
Thoreau.
Who's publishing that?
The various presses around the country. I think Thoreau is published by Princeton. Hawthorne, I think, is Ohio State.
Are these with notes or no?
Oh yeah, they're intended for scholars. And they deal with such textual variants and so on. Stimulated by that, a group at Northwestern University started the Melville Edition, which was published and just recently completed by Northwestern University Press and the Newberry Library.
Oh, in Chicago, yeah.
Yeah. But it took them over almost 40 years to get it all done, and that's what I'm writing on now. How difficult it was to get Melville into print. He was in print in the sense that Moby Dick was available, and some of the sea novels, but the late poetry, which is really good poetry, not.
And you were wanting to figure out
Yeah.
how come.
Yeah, just to figure out how it happened and who the figures were behind it and how it finally all shook out.
And can we look forward to a presentation somewhere on
I
that?
gave a paper on that at Sharp last summer.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was the summer of 2019.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. But so, what are you working on now? Are you taking?
I'm finishing that, trying to finish that up.
I see.
I have to get to Chicago to do.
So that'll be in print somewhere then.
Let's hope.
Okay. So we'll look forward to reading that
Yeah, yes.
somewhere, somehow, hopefully.
I look forward to reading it.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me about your experience with UMass Press and the whole field of book history, which owes a lot to you, I think.
Well, I certainly books. I owe a lot to books, and I love to talk book talk. So thank you for coming.
It's my pleasure. I've been talking with Paul Wright, who was the editor of UMass Press from 1988 to 2006 and is now a publishing and print culture historian. Thanks again.
Thank you.